Part 5. The Electric Revolution and the Scaling of Tesla, 2009 to 2016. Chapter 41. The Roadster. Proof of high-performance concept. The car accelerated and the journalist's head snapped back, and for a moment he forgot he was supposed to be taking notes. This was the intended effect, and it was produced with such reliable consistency across the journalists, the celebrities, the automotive executives, the venture capitalists, the policymakers who were given rides in the Tesla Roadster during its public introduction in 2008, that the SpaceX and Tesla teams had begun to track it as an informal metric. The head snap. The involuntary sound, something between a gasp and a laugh, that the human nervous system produces when it is subjected to acceleration that exceeds its prior model of what the available technology should be capable of delivering. The moment, always the same moment, when the person in the passenger seat stopped being a skeptic and became something else, a convert, or at minimum, a person whose skepticism had been complicated by direct physical evidence. The Roadster did 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds. It had a range of nearly 250 miles per charge. It was built on a modified Lotus Elise platform, lightweight, low-slung, possessed of the specific communicative handling quality that sports car engineers spend careers pursuing. And it was powered entirely by a lithium-ion battery pack containing nearly 7,000 individual cells, each one similar to the batteries used in consumer laptop computers, assembled into a system of sufficient energy density to make the range and the performance figures simultaneously achievable in a vehicle that weighed slightly under 3,000 pounds. None of this should have been possible, according to the automotive industry that had been professionally assessing the limits of electric vehicle technology for the better part of 3 decades. The possible, in that industry's estimation, was the GM EV1, a vehicle that had been designed to demonstrate compliance rather than desire, that had been leased to customers rather than sold, and that had been recalled and crushed when the compliance calculation changed, producing a documentary film whose title described its fate. The possible was the Toyota Prius, a hybrid that used electricity to assist a gasoline engine that optimized for efficiency rather than performance, and that had succeeded commercially by positioning itself as a virtue rather than a pleasure. Electric cars were possible as appliances. Electric cars as objects of genuine desire, sports cars, prestige vehicles, things that people bought because they wanted rather than because they were trying to make a statement about their relationship to the environment, were not, the industry had concluded, possible. The energy density wasn't there. The cost wasn't there. The performance wasn't there. The head snap said otherwise. The world into which the Roadster arrived for customer deliveries in early 2008, and into which it was delivering its head-snapping argument throughout 2009, as Musk consolidated his CEO role, and the company began to stabilize after the Christmas Eve near-death, was a world that had been developing for several years, a specific and newly urgent anxiety about the relationship between the internal combustion engine and the civilization built around it. The anxiety had multiple sources. The price of oil had spiked to nearly $150 per barrel in the summer of 2008, before the financial crisis collapsed it, demonstrating the economy's vulnerability to commodity price volatility in a way that recession eventually obscured but did not resolve. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had published its 4th assessment report in 2007, delivering the most comprehensive and unambiguous summary of climate science yet produced, a document that made the connection between fossil fuel combustion and atmospheric warming not a hypothesis but a conclusion, supported by evidence of a quality and quantity that had been accumulating for decades and had reached, in the IPCC's assessment, the threshold of scientific consensus. The political response to this consensus was, in most countries, and certainly in the United States, significantly slower than the scientific case warranted. But the cultural conversation had changed. The question of whether climate change was real was giving way, among people who paid attention to such things, to the question of what was to be done about it. Against this backdrop, the Roadster was not merely a car. It was a proof of concept for a theory about how the transition away from fossil fuels could be organized. A theory that Musk had been developing since before SpaceX, since the graduate school coursework in energy physics he had not finished but had kept thinking about, and that he had articulated with increasing precision, as Tesla had moved from a startup to a going concern to a company that had survived 2008, and was now attempting to scale. The theory was this: the transition to sustainable energy would not be driven by guilt or regulation, or the abstract imperative of avoiding catastrophe. It would be driven by desire. People needed to want the alternative before they would choose it, and they would want it only if it was better, faster, more beautiful, more thrilling, more consistent with the self-image of the people who could afford to pay for it, than what it was replacing. The top-down strategy that structured Tesla's product roadmap was the operational expression of this theory. Start with a high-priced, high-performance sports car. Use the revenue from that car, and the proof of concept it provided, to fund the development of a premium sedan. Use the revenue from the sedan to fund the development of a mass-market vehicle. Each step down the price ladder was funded by the step above it, and each step was made possible by the battery technology and the manufacturing knowledge and the brand credibility that accumulated as the program progressed. It was a strategy that accepted the slowness of the descent toward affordability. The Roadster was $100,000, which meant its market was, by definition, narrow, in exchange for the ability to begin the descent from a position of demonstrated technical capability rather than theoretical promise. The core conflict of the Roadster chapter was not the strategy, which was coherent, but the execution, which was not. Not because the people executing it were inadequate, but because the execution revealed, with the specific clarity that only hardware manufacture provides, the gap between what battery technology could do in a laboratory environment and what it could do in a production vehicle subjected to the thermal management requirements and the vibration environment, and the customer expectations of a sports car that was being sold for the price of a Porsche. The transmission was the first crisis. The Roadster's original two-speed transmission, designed to extend the vehicle's performance across a broader speed range than a single-speed system could manage, proved unable to survive the torque that the electric motor produced, and the failures were occurring in test vehicles with a frequency and a mechanism that the supplier had not anticipated and could not quickly resolve. The engineering team had spent months and significant capital developing the transmission, and the transmission had failed, and the options were not good. Continue with the failed design and hope for a solution that was not materializing, or switch to a single-speed transmission and accept the performance compromises that a single-speed system imposed, or delay the vehicle while a workable solution was developed. Musk chose the single-speed transmission. The decision was made with the specific, unsentimental practicality of someone who has been through enough development crises to have lost the attachment to sunk costs that paralyzes less experienced operators. The recognition that the money spent on the failed transmission was spent, that the question was not how to recover it, but what decision made now would produce the best outcome going forward. The single-speed transmission worked. The performance figures it produced were still exceptional. The head snap remained intact, and the vehicle that was delivered to customers was, on the metrics that mattered most to the people buying it, better than anything else available in the market it was trying to create. The compromise that the transmission decision required was one that Musk has acknowledged in subsequent interviews with the directness that characterizes his relationship to his own decisions. It was the right choice, and it cost something, and the cost was real. Customers who had been promised a two-speed transmission received a single-speed one. The communication of this change, when it was made, how it was framed, what compensations were offered, was handled with varying degrees of grace, and the legal and reputational consequences of the handling were themselves a development program lesson about the relationship between product promises and product delivery that Tesla carried forward into every subsequent vehicle launch. The figure whose relationship with Musk most directly shaped the Roadster's transition from engineering project to cultural event was Franz von Holzhausen, the automotive designer who joined Tesla in 2008 as chief designer, and who brought to the company a specific quality of aesthetic sensibility that the engineering culture Musk had built had not previously incorporated at the level of leadership. Von Holzhausen had worked at Volkswagen and Mazda before Tesla, and he carried from those experiences an understanding of how design functions in the automotive market that was different in emphasis from the engineering-first culture Musk had cultivated. For Musk, design was a dimension of function. The shape of the car should be determined by the requirements of aerodynamics and efficiency and the experience of the driver, and aesthetics that didn't serve those requirements were aesthetics that needed to be justified. For von Holzhausen, Design was the point at which function and desire intersected, and the intersection was where the car became an object that people wanted to live with rather than merely use. And the wanting was not a luxury but a requirement if Tesla was going to change the automotive market rather than merely occupy a niche in it. The dialogue between them, between Musk's engineering-derived aesthetic instincts and von Holzhausen's design-derived ones, produced, in the Model S that was already in early development while the Roadster was being delivered, a vehicle whose visual character was different from the Roadster in the specific way that a settled argument is different from an ongoing one. The Roadster looked like what it was, a modified Lotus with an electric drivetrain, the design constrained by the platform it was built on. The Model S, which von Holzhausen's work was shaping in the Hawthorne studio while Musk reviewed iterations between his SpaceX commitments, looked like something that had been imagined from scratch for the purpose it was serving. A car designed to be an electric car rather than converted to one, whose proportions and character reflected the specific freedom that the absence of an internal combustion engine provided. The Roadster sold approximately 2,400 units before production ended in 2012. By the volume standards of the automotive industry, this was a negligible number, a rounding error in the quarterly production reports of any of the major manufacturers whose market positions Tesla was on the strategic roadmap, intending eventually to challenge. By the standards of what the Roadster was actually for, the number was precisely adequate. It was enough to have made the proof of concept visible, to have generated the revenue that funded the Model S development in its early phase, and to have established in the automotive and technology and investment communities the foundational belief that Tesla's strategy was not a fantasy. The head snap had done its work. The people whose heads had snapped, the journalists whose reviews had been uniformly and sometimes reluctantly admiring, the investors whose conviction had been physicalized in a test drive, the automotive executives who had taken the wheel and felt the torque and returned to their offices to order the electric vehicle studies that they had been deferring, were now part of a world in which the question had changed. The question was no longer whether an electric car could be desirable. The question was whether Tesla could build one at scale, at a price that reached beyond the narrow market of $100,000 sports cars, before the competitors who had been watching the Roadster and drawing their conclusions about what it demonstrated had time to deploy the capital and the manufacturing capability they had in quantities that Tesla, still a startup with a nascent production line, and a CEO who was splitting his attention between Hawthorne and this, did not. The Model S was being designed in a studio a few miles from the Roadster production line, and the gap between the car taking shape on von Holzhausen's screens and the car that would need to be manufactured at a volume and a cost that justified Tesla's continued existence was a gap that the Roadster's success had made famous, and that the automotive industry, which had now seen the proof of concept and updated its priors accordingly, was moving with increasing urgency to close before Tesla could close it first. Chapter 42. The 2010 IPO, Accessing Public Markets. The morning of June 29, 2010, carried a particular weight in the air above Lower Manhattan. On the floor of the NASDAQ exchange, a cluster of Tesla employees, engineers, and executives had gathered beneath the digital cascade of numbers that defined American capitalism's central nervous system. Elon Musk stood among them, dressed not in the rehearsed ease of a veteran financier, but with the coiled, slightly formal posture of a man who understood the gravity of ritual without quite surrendering to its comfort. He had not slept much. He rarely did before events of consequence. The opening bell had not yet rung, and already the ticker symbol TSLA waited in the system like a detonator primed and counting. Those who stood close to him that morning later recalled that he did not make small talk. He watched the screens. His jaw moved slightly, as though he were running calculations no one else in the room could hear. When the shares finally opened at $17 and then climbed, rising in the opening hours to $23, then beyond, a kind of stunned relief crossed his face before discipline closed over it again. This was not triumph. This was oxygen. For a company that had come within days of its own extinction barely 18 months earlier, the IPO was less a celebration than a reprieve issued by the market itself, a verdict rendered not in words but in capital. To understand what it meant for Tesla to go public in June of 2010 is to understand the landscape into which that offering arrived, scarred, skeptical, and still raw from the worst financial catastrophe in living memory. The 2008 financial crisis had not merely damaged American confidence, it had restructured the emotional grammar of the investing public. Risk was a word spoken carefully now, if at all. The Detroit automakers, General Motors and Chrysler, had only the previous year required federal bailouts totaling tens of billions of dollars. Their collapse a slow-motion catastrophe that had humiliated an entire industrial tradition. Two of America's most storied companies, manufacturers whose logos had been stamped into the national consciousness since the early 20th century, had been escorted through bankruptcy with the help of taxpayer money and government ownership. The optics were devastating, and the lesson seemed clear. The American automobile industry was not a place for optimism. Into this climate, Elon Musk proposed something that, described plainly, sounded almost willfully delusional. He intended to build a new American car company from scratch. An electric one. Aimed initially at the luxury market. During a period when Americans were losing their homes and watching their retirement accounts hollow out, he planned to sell a sedan whose base price would exceed $50,000, a car powered not by gasoline, but by lithium-ion battery cells of the type found in laptop computers. The analysts who covered the sector were not uniformly cruel, but neither were they persuaded. The electric vehicle space had a long history of charming failures. General Motors had canceled the EV1 a decade earlier under murky circumstances that still provoked conspiracy theories in certain corners of the environmental movement. Better Place, the battery-swapping startup, backed by serious venture capital, was still alive in 2010 but lurching. The Chevy Volt, GM's hybrid offering, was coming, but carried with it the institutional conservatism of a company that had nearly ceased to exist. Tesla was, as far as most of the financial world was concerned, an elegant bet against history. The company's prospectus, filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission in January of 2010, told a story of breathtaking ambition backed by genuinely alarming financial data. Tesla had never turned a profit. It had accumulated over $200 million in net losses. The Roadster, the company's first production vehicle, was built on a modified Lotus chassis and assembled in England, a fact that underscored the company's still fragile manufacturing capabilities. The production rate was modest, the margins tight, and the path to the Model S, the mass-market sedan that Musk believed would define Tesla's future, required capital the company did not have. The IPO was not optional. It was existential. The deeper conflict of this moment, however, was not merely financial. It was philosophical, and it lived inside Musk himself with a particular ferocity. He had made the decision, in the winter of 2008, to invest his last personal reserves into Tesla and SpaceX simultaneously, a gamble that had left him, by his own account, emotionally broken and financially dependent on emergency loans from friends while his marriage dissolved around him. That decision had worked. Both companies had survived. But the experience had not made him cautious. If anything, it had calcified something in him, a certainty that conventional risk assessment was a failure of imagination. The problem with the financial world, in Musk's private cosmology, was not that it demanded evidence, it was that it demanded the wrong kind. Spreadsheets could not capture trajectory. Quarterly projections could not model the arc of a revolution. And yet, standing before the IPO, he had to speak that language. He had to translate his singular conviction into terms that institutional investors and retail buyers could understand well enough to hand over their money. This was not a comfortable translation for a man whose natural mode of persuasion ran toward technical density and visionary scale rather than the careful hedging of an S1 filing. He sat through roadshow presentations with the focused discipline of someone performing a necessary task rather than enjoying a stage, answering the same questions about profitability timelines and manufacturing costs that he found in private somewhat beside the point. The point, the actual civilization scale point, was that the world was going to have to stop burning fossil fuels, and the automobile was the most visible and tractable place to begin. And Tesla was going to demonstrate that electrification did not require sacrifice, that an electric car could be faster and sleeker and more thrilling than anything Detroit had produced in a generation. That was the argument. But venture capital had already heard that argument. Now the argument had to come with a balance sheet. There's a moment from the roadshow that those who witnessed it have carried with them since. At a presentation to institutional investors in New York, a skeptical portfolio manager pressed Musk on the competition that would inevitably come, the moment when Toyota or Ford or Volkswagen mobilized their resources and their manufacturing scale and came for the electric vehicle market in earnest. The conventional answer, the prudent answer, would have acknowledged the threat and outlined defensive strategies. Musk paused, and then said something to the effect that he hoped the major automakers would accelerate their electric programs, that the goal was never to beat General Motors in the marketplace, but to prove to General Motors that it had no choice but to compete. There was a beat of silence. He was, in the middle of a sales presentation designed to raise capital, arguing that his company's highest ambition was to make itself unnecessary as a first mover. It was either madness or the clearest statement of mission that anyone in that room had ever heard from a CEO pitching shares. The IPO raised $226 million, pricing at $17 a share and giving Tesla a valuation of approximately $1.7 billion. It was, by the standards of the day, a credible debut. But the number that mattered more, the one that would define the chapter's consequence in the years that followed, was the simultaneity of the offering with a strategic investment from Toyota Motor Corporation, which injected $50 million into Tesla and formalized an agreement to jointly develop electric vehicles using Tesla's powertrain technology. The pairing was not accidental. Musk had cultivated the relationship with deliberate care, understanding that institutional credibility, the visible endorsement of one of the world's most respected manufacturers, would carry a different signal to the public markets than any set of financial projections could. Toyota did not invest in fantasies. If Toyota was in, the implicit message to investors ran, then perhaps the electric future was not so speculative after all. The relationship between Musk and Jeffrey Straubel, Tesla's chief technical officer and the engineer most responsible for the company's battery architecture, took on a particular texture during this period. Straubel was, in almost every visible way, Musk's temperamental opposite. Where Musk operated in the register of declared certainty, Straubel moved through problems with the patience of a researcher, careful, rigorous, reluctant to overclaim. He had been, in the early years, the quiet engine of Tesla's technical credibility, the person in the room who could answer the hard engineering questions that Musk's vision required, but that Musk's schedule did not always permit him to master in full. In the months around the IPO, their dynamic sharpened into something more defined. Musk was consuming the company's external narrative, the roadshows, the press, the investor relations, with an intensity that left the internal technical work more fully in Straubel's hands than ever before. Straubel carried it. He did not make demands for visibility or credit. He was, in this way, the kind of collaborator that Musk's temperament most required and least often celebrated, a person capable of translating ambition into engineering reality without needing the credit for the translation. The IPO's success was publicly Musk's. The battery systems that made the IPO plausible were Straubel's. Both men understood this. Neither said it aloud. The capital from the IPO did not arrive without its own turbulence. The months that followed the June offering brought with them the full weight of what Tesla had promised investors it could deliver: a mass-market electric sedan, the Model S, designed from the ground up as an electric vehicle rather than a conversion, priced to reach a consumer class wider than the Roadster's narrow band of early adopters and tech enthusiasts. The factory to build it did not yet exist. The manufacturing processes had not been designed. The supply chains for battery cells at the scale Tesla required were theoretical. The money was real. The product was not yet. Musk responded to this gap in the way he almost always responded to gaps. He closed the distance between the present reality and the demanded future by sheer velocity of will, working hours that compressed his personal life into a series of residual obligations, sleeping at the factory when it was necessary, inserting himself into engineering decisions at a level of granularity that made his executives occasionally feel supervised rather than empowered. He was, in this period, simultaneously Tesla's chief executive, its most effective salesperson, its most demanding engineer, and its most consequential liability, because the company's market credibility was now so fused with his personal narrative that any visible failure of nerve, any moment of public doubt, would have effects that extended beyond his own balance sheet into the accounts of every shareholder who had bought into the story he had told on the roadshow. This was the peculiar trap that the IPO had constructed around him, not maliciously, not even obviously, but structurally. Going public meant that Tesla's story now had to be told continuously, quarterly, with a discipline and consistency that the private company's crisis mode existence had never required. Musk had always operated best in binaries. The company either survives or it does not. We either build the rocket or we fail. The car works or it does not. Public markets demanded a different grammar, gradations, forward guidance, the managed expectation. He would spend years learning, not always gracefully, how to speak that language without corrupting the vision it was meant to protect. The factory in Fremont, California, the former NUMMI plant, jointly operated by Toyota and General Motors before the crisis shuttered it, was announced in October of 2010, just months after the IPO. A building of extraordinary scale dropped into Tesla's future like a dare. Nearly 5.5 million square feet of manufacturing floor. A facility that had once produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually, now purchased by a company that had produced fewer than 2,000 in its entire history. Standing inside it for the first time, Musk reportedly said very little. He walked the floor, ran his hand along one of the old production lines, and looked down the length of the building until the far wall was barely visible in the industrial haze. Then he said they would need to make it larger. What he could not yet see, what no one standing in that enormous echoing space could have predicted with confidence, was that the machinery of production he was about to attempt to master would prove as combustible, as unpredictable, and as capable of bringing the whole enterprise to the edge of ruin as any financial crisis or market skepticism ever had, and that the very culture of speed and declared invincibility that had carried Tesla to its public offering would become, on the factory floor, a force as dangerous as any competitor Detroit could send against him. Chapter 43. The Model S, disrupting the luxury segment. The car sat on the stage under lights, calibrated to make metal look like water. It was June 22, 2012, at the Tesla factory in Fremont, California, and Elon Musk stood before it with the particular stillness of a man who had been rehearsing this moment not for weeks but for years, perhaps, if you accepted his own account of his motivations for his entire adult life. The first production Model S had just rolled off the line, and Musk was presenting the keys personally to the first customers, a small group of reservation holders who had waited through delays and revisions and the ambient uncertainty of a company that had nearly ceased to exist on multiple occasions. He spoke slowly that evening, more slowly than his natural cadence, as though he understood that speed would diminish the weight of what he was saying. His voice, when he addressed the room, carried a quality that those who covered him closely had not often heard before. Not the compressed urgency of the pitch, not the technical density of the engineering review, but something closer to relief, complicated and genuine, the voice of a man who had not been entirely certain in his private hours that this night would come. He told the audience that he hoped they would love the car. It was, for Musk, an unusually tender sentence. The world into which the Model S arrived in the summer of 2012 was one engaged in a slow, contested argument with itself about the future of energy. The Obama administration had staked a portion of its economic recovery narrative on green technology, backing a portfolio of clean energy companies through the Department of Energy's Loan Guarantee Program, a program that had given Tesla itself a $465 million loan in 2010, and that had also backed Solyndra, the solar panel manufacturer whose spectacular bankruptcy in late 2011 had become a political weapon in the hands of those who believed the government had no business selecting industrial winners. The Solyndra collapse cast a shadow over every federally supported clean energy venture, and Tesla, whether fairly or not, was mentioned in the same breath by critics looking to extend the narrative of government overreach into foolish bets. Congressional Republicans had begun asking pointed questions about the Tesla loan. The political environment was not hostile to Tesla specifically, but it was hostile to the category Tesla occupied, and Musk understood that the Model S could not merely be good. It had to be undeniable. The broader automotive culture was undergoing its own anxious recalibration. Gas prices had spiked above $4 a gallon in several American markets during the spring of 2012, reviving consumer interest in fuel efficiency that had softened during the brief period of post-crisis price relief. The Nissan Leaf and the Chevrolet Volt were both in market, earnest and competent and thoroughly uninspiring. Vehicles that ask their drivers to make a sacrifice for a principle, to accept lesser performance and greater inconvenience in exchange for a smaller carbon footprint. The unspoken assumption embedded in every competing electric vehicle of that era was that the customer would need to want an EV before they would buy one. The car would not seduce them. The ideology would have to do the work. This assumption had calcified into something close to industry consensus, and it was precisely the assumption that Musk intended to destroy. The obstacle he faced in bringing the Model S to market was not, at its core, technological. Tesla's engineers had solved the fundamental problems of range, charging architecture, and battery thermal management with a sophistication that exceeded anything available in a production vehicle. The obstacle was manufacturing, the brutal, unromantic, deeply unglamorous problem of building complex physical objects at scale with consistency and speed. Musk had purchased the Fremont factory with the confidence of a man who believed that the principles governing software iteration, build fast, identify failures, iterate, repeat, could be applied to the assembly of a $50,000 automobile. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either, and the distance between those two positions cost Tesla time and money and human patience in quantities that tested everyone involved. The early months of production were, by the candid accounts of people who lived through them, a controlled emergency. The supply chain for components sourced from dozens of vendors had not been stress-tested at volume. Assembly processes that worked perfectly in prototype conditions revealed their fragility the moment they were subjected to the cadence of a production line. Quality control issues that would have been caught by the kind of manufacturing experience that legacy automakers had accumulated over decades fell through gaps that Tesla's relative youth made invisible until they were already expensive. Musk responded to each problem with the same energy, which is to say all of it. He moved through the factory at hours when factories are not typically inhabited by chief executives, standing at specific stations in the assembly process, asking questions that were sometimes illuminating and sometimes maddening, depending on which engineer was receiving them. He had a habit of identifying a problem with crystalline accuracy and then proposing a solution that required the reorganization of processes 3 levels removed from the specific failure. Solutions that were often correct, but that imposed a kind of organizational whiplash on teams already operating at the edge of their capacity. The deeper character of his leadership during this period is perhaps best captured by a single decision he made in the spring of 2012, weeks before the delivery event, when quality testing on early production units returned results that he found unacceptable. The specific metrics involved panel gaps, the uniformity of spacing between body panels, a detail that most consumers would never consciously notice, but that automobile reviewers, and particularly the reviewers at publications whose opinions could make or break a luxury vehicle's market reception, would measure with instruments. Musk, who had once told an interviewer that he drove every Tesla personally before approving production changes, was shown the data and then shown the cars. He looked at them for a long time. Then he pushed back the delivery date. It was not a popular decision internally. The financial pressure to begin deliveries was severe. Every week of delay was a week without revenue from a vehicle that had taken hundreds of millions of dollars to develop, a vehicle whose production costs were still running above the projections the company had given investors. The team argued the gaps were within industry tolerance. Musk's response, reconstructed from multiple accounts, was essentially that industry tolerance was not the standard he was applying, that if they were building a car that needed to be better than a Mercedes or a BMW to justify its existence in the market, then it needed to be better than a Mercedes or a BMW in every dimension a reviewer would examine, including the ones customers would never consciously notice. The car went back. The gaps were fixed. The delivery happened later. This story has been told in various forms as evidence of Musk's perfectionism, which it is. But it is also evidence of something more specific and more revealing about how his mind worked at moments of maximum pressure. He was not, at his best, a man who made decisions by consensus or by the average of his advisors' opinions. He was a man who decided by his own hierarchy of importance, a hierarchy that was not always legible to the people around him, but that had, in cases like this, an internal logic that events would ultimately vindicate. The Model S that shipped to its first customers was not merely a good electric car. It was, by the measured assessment of reviewers who had no particular stake in Tesla's survival, a great car in the absolute category, a vehicle that rewarded comparison with the finest products of German and Japanese engineering on terms that had nothing to do with its powertrain. Franz von Holzhausen had been Tesla's chief designer since 2008, recruited from Mazda by Musk with the particular intensity that Musk brought to the pursuit of any talent he had decided he needed. Von Holzhausen was, in the company's internal culture, something of an anomaly, a designer of genuine aesthetic conviction, working inside an engineering-dominant organization led by a man whose relationship to beauty was instrumental rather than intrinsic. Musk valued design in the way he valued anything, for what it accomplished, for the market signal it sent, for the way it affected the customer's willingness to pay and to believe. Von Holzhausen valued it in a different register. The relationship between them, during the Model S development, had been productive and occasionally abrasive in the way that productive relationships between people of genuine conviction tend to be. Musk had specific ideas about the car's proportions, its stance, its interior philosophy. Von Holzhausen had different ideas. The negotiations between these positions, conducted in design reviews that could run for hours and that Musk did not always leave having said the last word, produced the car that arrived in 2012. What the Model S looked like, to the eye of someone encountering it cold on a showroom floor, was a car that had been designed by people who were not afraid. It had the long hood and fastback silhouette of a grand touring sedan, the kind of form language that European manufacturers deployed to signal hereditary confidence. It did not look apologetic. It did not carry the visual grammar of environmental virtue that had marked earlier electric and hybrid vehicles. The teardrop shapes, the unusual wheel covers, the slight air of inconvenience worn as a badge. It looked fast. It looked expensive, in the particular way that objects look expensive when no single element announces its cost, when the expense is distributed across proportion and finish, and the quality of negative space. Von Holzhausen and Musk had argued their way to something that neither of them could have produced alone, and the result was a car whose exterior was, in the judgment of the automotive press, among the best designs of its generation regardless of powertrain. The reviews, when they arrived in the second half of 2012, were not kind. They were extraordinary. Motor Trend awarded the Model S its Car of the Year for 2013, the first time in the award's 63-year history that a vehicle not powered by an internal combustion engine had won. The citation was careful and detailed, and amounted to an argument that the Model S had not won despite being electric, but in some meaningful sense because of it, that the absence of a traditional drivetrain had liberated the car's designers and engineers from constraints so embedded in automotive thinking that most manufacturers had ceased to recognize them as constraints at all. Consumer Reports, whose ratings carried the peculiar credibility of dispassion, tested the Model S and gave it a score of 99 out of 100. A number so high that it required the publication to revisit its own scoring methodology. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration tested it, and could not assign a star rating, because the car's roof strength exceeded the capability of the testing equipment. This last detail, the roof, acquired a kind of totemic significance in the way Tesla and Musk deployed it publicly. It was not merely a safety data point. It was a rhetorical device, compressed and devastating. The car was so structurally robust that the government's machines for measuring structural robustness broke before the car did. Musk repeated the statistic with a satisfaction that was not quite pride, and not quite mischief, but something between them, the satisfaction of a man who had been told for years that his ambitions exceeded reality, and who had found, in a single number, a way to make reality argue for him. The Model S did not merely sell well in the second half of 2012. It sold with a velocity that surprised even Tesla's internal projections, which were themselves projections that outside analysts had considered optimistic. The company's stock, which had traded in the low 20s through much of 2012, began the long upward movement that would become one of the defining financial stories of the decade. Short sellers, who had accumulated significant positions against Tesla on the reasonable grounds that the company's economics were fragile and its market claims extravagant, began to experience the particular financial distress of a thesis that is being proved wrong in real time by a car company in California that should not, according to all conventional analysis, have been performing the way it was performing. The Model S had done what Musk had insisted it must do. It had removed ideology from the transaction. Buyers were not purchasing the Model S because they believed in electrification. They were purchasing it because it was faster than almost anything else in its price range, because Consumer Reports had given it a number no car had ever received, because it was, in the blunt empirical assessment of the automotive press, better. The argument that an electric vehicle required compromise had not been addressed. It had been rendered obsolete. What no one standing in the glow of those reviews could yet see clearly, what Musk himself, in the compressed euphoria of validated conviction, may not have fully weighted, was that the same culture of declared invincibility that had willed the Model S into existence was already constructing the conditions for a different kind of reckoning, one that would arrive not in a boardroom or a design review, but on a factory floor in Fremont at 3 a.m, when the gap between what Musk had promised the world and what physics and human capacity could actually deliver would become a crisis with its own particular and unforgiving arithmetic. Chapter 44. Superchargers. Building the vertically integrated ecosystem. The drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco takes roughly 6 hours in a gasoline-powered car, assuming the 101 is behaving, assuming no construction through the Salinas Valley, assuming the ordinary patience of a long American highway. In September of 2012, Elon Musk made the drive in a Model S. He did not make it alone. A small convoy of Tesla vehicles and support personnel accompanied him. But the psychological architecture of the journey was solitary in the way that all demonstration drives are solitary, because the point was not the company but the distance, and the distance was the argument. Somewhere along that corridor of California farmland and coastal scrub, at a stop that had been prepared in advance at a location that would soon become one of Tesla's first supercharger stations, Musk stepped out of the car while it charged, and stood in the dry Central Valley air with the expression that people who traveled with him had learned to read. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the forward-leaning attention of a man already solving the next problem while the current one resolved itself behind him. The car was charging at a rate no electric vehicle had charged before in public infrastructure. In 30 minutes, it would have enough range to complete the journey. He looked at his watch. He looked at the charging cable. He said nothing that anyone later recorded. He didn't need to. The number on the charging display was saying it for him. The Supercharger network was announced publicly on September 24, 2012. 6 stations along the California corridor, each capable of delivering what Tesla called Level 3 DC fast charging, a rate so far beyond the existing public charging infrastructure that the comparison required a new vocabulary. Where the Level 2 chargers that had constituted the public charging ecosystem could replenish a depleted battery over 8 to 12 hours, Tesla's superchargers could deliver half a charge in 20 minutes and a substantial majority of range in under 40. The energy for Model S owners at the time of the announcement was free. Musk announced this last detail with the timing of a man who had thought carefully about the order in which information should arrive. Because the free electricity was not merely a financial inducement, it was a signal, a statement of intent. A declaration that Tesla was not building a charging network as a revenue stream but as infrastructure, the same way a highway is infrastructure. Something you build because the system requires it rather than because the individual transaction pencils out. To understand why this mattered so acutely, in late 2012, requires stepping back into the specific texture of electric vehicle anxiety at that moment. Range anxiety, the fear of being stranded with a depleted battery far from a charging point, was not a marketing fiction invented by critics of electrification. It was a genuine psychological barrier embedded in the experience of every early electric vehicle owner who had calculated their route against their remaining charge with the focused unease of someone managing a resource that could not be replenished on demand. The existing public charging infrastructure was a patchwork of Level 2 stations installed by utilities, municipalities, and commercial property owners with no coordinated standard and no consistent availability. You could find a charging station on a map, drive to it, and discover that it was occupied or broken or behind a locked gate, or compatible with a different plug standard than your vehicle required. The experience was not designed. It had accumulated. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and the difference was costing the electric vehicle category customers it could not afford to lose. The broader political and cultural atmosphere around energy in 2012 carried its own static. The presidential election that November would feature energy policy as a genuine fault line, with the Obama administration's green energy investments under sustained attack following Solindra's collapse, and with the natural gas boom, driven by hydraulic fracturing technology that had unlocked enormous domestic reserves, shifting the terms of the energy independence argument in ways that made fossil fuel advocates newly confident. Gasoline prices, which had briefly spiked in the spring, had moderated by fall, reducing the immediate economic pressure that drove consumers toward fuel alternatives. The Chevy Volt was in its second model year and selling in modest numbers. The Nissan Leaf was available nationally and similarly modest in its market penetration. The narrative that electric vehicles were a niche product for early adopters and ideology-driven consumers rather than a genuine automotive alternative was not losing ground in 2012. If anything, it was consolidating. Musk understood the charging problem as a systems problem, and systems problems were where his thinking operated most naturally. The issue was not the car. The Model S had demonstrated, with a comprehensiveness that foreclosed most technical objections, that an electric vehicle could match or exceed its gasoline competitors in every performance dimension. The issue was the context in which the car existed, the infrastructure that surrounded it, the mental map of availability and convenience that a driver carried when they imagined taking the car somewhere beyond their daily orbit. You could build the most extraordinary vehicle in automotive history and lose the sale to a Honda Accord, because the customer could not answer the question of what they would do on a road trip. Musk had been thinking about this problem since before the Model S existed, and his conclusion had the simplicity of ideas that seem obvious only after someone has committed to them fully. Tesla would have to build the network itself. This decision was not universally embraced inside the company or among its investors. The capital requirements for a national fast-charging network, the land agreements, the electrical infrastructure, the hardware at each station, the ongoing operational costs, were substantial, and Tesla in 2012 was not a company with substantial capital to deploy speculatively. The Supercharger program was, in financial terms, a bet that the infrastructure would accelerate vehicle sales by enough to justify its own cost, a bet that required the charging network to function not as a profit center but as a marketing asset of the highest order. The investors who had bought into Tesla's story were buying a car company. They were now being asked, implicitly, to fund a national energy distribution network as well. Some of them asked pointed questions. Musk's answers were characteristically direct. The network was not optional, and the returns would not appear on a charging revenue line because that was not what the network was for. The core conflict of the Supercharger build was not financial, though. It was physical and logistical in a way that tested the limits of what a company of Tesla's size could execute simultaneously with its other obligations. Each Supercharger station required a site agreement with a property owner, typically a hotel, a restaurant cluster, or a retail location along a major highway corridor, that had to be negotiated individually. It required an electrical service upgrade that involved the local utility and could take months to permit and install. It required the design and manufacture of the charging hardware itself, hardware that Tesla was developing internally rather than sourcing from an existing supplier, because no existing supplier made equipment to the specifications that Tesla's charging protocol required. Every one of these dependencies existed in the real world, which is to say, they existed in a state of bureaucratic and logistical friction that Musk's natural operating tempo treated as an affront. He managed this friction in the way he managed most large-scale operational friction, by compressing the timelines until the organization had no option but to find ways around the obstacles rather than through them. He had announced at the September 2012 event that Tesla would build enough Supercharger stations to allow coast-to-coast travel in the United States within a year. This was not, at the time he said it, a projection that his own engineering and infrastructure teams had confirmed was achievable. It was a deadline issued as a declaration, the kind of commitment that creates its own pressure by making the alternative, failing to deliver on a promise made publicly by the chief executive, more painful than whatever it cost to meet it. His teams understood the mechanism. They had seen it operate before. They built the stations. There is a particular moment from the internal history of the Supercharger program that illuminates the specific quality of Musk's involvement in technical decisions that other executives would have delegated entirely. During the development of the Supercharger hardware, a debate arose about the connector standard, the physical plug that would couple the charging station to the vehicle. The existing landscape of EV charging standards was already fragmented, with different plugs and protocols competing for adoption across the industry. The logical argument, made by several people inside Tesla and by voices outside it, was that Tesla should adopt or at least build toward compatibility with the emerging combined charging system standard that the major automakers and a coalition of utilities were coalescing around. Compatibility would make Tesla vehicles usable on third-party charging infrastructure and would position the company as a cooperative participant in the industry's broader electrification effort rather than a proprietary enclave. Musk rejected the argument. His position, stated with the compression of someone who has run the analysis and arrived at a fixed point, was that the CCS standard was inferior, technically in charging rate and connector ergonomics, and philosophically in that it had been designed by committee to satisfy the requirements of manufacturers who were not yet certain they were serious about electrification. Tesla would build its own connector, its own protocol, its own network. It would be better than the alternative. If the alternative wanted to become better, it could study what Tesla had built. The decision was consistent with the founding logic of Tesla's existence, the belief that you could not build a revolutionary product by designing to the consensus of an industry that was not yet committed to the revolution. But it carried costs that would compound quietly for years, a walled garden of charging infrastructure that would become both Tesla's greatest competitive advantage and one of the more complex strategic liabilities in its long-term relationship with the broader EV ecosystem. J.B. Straubel's fingerprints were on the Supercharger hardware at a level of technical depth that matched his contribution to the vehicle's battery architecture. The relationship between Musk and Straubel during the Supercharger development period had taken on the quality of a long collaboration that no longer required much explicit negotiation. Two people who had worked together through enough crises that their respective domains were implicitly understood. Musk set the performance targets and the timeline and the commercial logic. Straubel determined whether the physics permitted what Musk had declared would happen, and when the initial answer was that the physics required more time than Musk had allocated, found ways to satisfy both the engineering reality and the declared timeline that preserved both men's position. It was not an equal partnership in any organizational sense. Musk was unambiguously in command, and Straubel operated within that structure without apparent resentment. But it was a genuine intellectual partnership, the kind in which each party is more capable in the presence of the other than they would be alone, and the Supercharger system was as clear a product of that partnership as anything Tesla made. By the end of 2013, Tesla had stations along the major interstate corridors of the continental United States, roughly positioned so that the distance between any two stations did not exceed the comfortable range of a Model S in normal driving conditions. The coast-to-coast commitment Musk had made from the stage in September 2012 had been honored, close enough to the promised timeline that the delta was not an embarrassment. The network was not large, dozens of stations rather than the thousands that would eventually exist, but its strategic significance was already outsized relative to its physical footprint. Every time a Tesla owner drove from New York to Boston or from Los Angeles to Las Vegas and stopped at a Supercharger station and walked inside to have coffee while the car recharged and then returned to a vehicle with sufficient range to complete the journey, an argument was settled. Not the argument about climate change or energy policy or the economics of battery production. The argument about inconvenience. The argument that had been, for most consumers, more practically decisive than any of the larger ones. The foreign automotive press began running a specific kind of story in 2013 and 2014. Dispatches from American Supercharger stations that described the experience of long-distance electric travel with the slightly dazed tone of journalists encountering something they had been told was not yet possible. The stories had a similar structure, The range anxiety, the stop, the coffee, the surprise at how fast the charging was, the arrival. Musk read these stories. He saved some of them. His team was told about others. He did not say, publicly, that this was exactly what he had designed the network to produce. The story of the story. The secondary narrative of a journalist discovering that a constraint had been removed. He didn't need to say it. He had understood from the beginning that the Supercharger network's most important product was not kilowatt-hours of electricity, but the permission it gave customers to imagine a life in which an electric car was simply a car. What neither Musk nor his team could see clearly from inside the momentum of that success was that the Supercharger network's proprietary architecture, the deliberate choice to build a closed system superior to everything else rather than a compatible system integrated with everything else, was planting a tension that would take a decade to surface fully. A tension between Tesla's role as an innovator whose advantage derived from its separateness and its potential role as an infrastructure provider whose value derived from its openness, and that the resolution of that tension would arrive in circumstances and under pressures that no one in Fremont in 2013 could have predicted or would have chosen. Chapter 45. Solar City, the Integrated Energy Vision. The whiteboard in the conference room at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne had been filled and erased and filled again over the course of what had become a very long evening in late 2006. Elon Musk stood at its center with a marker in his hand, which was where he was most comfortable, at the place where an idea met a surface and could be forced into structure. His cousins, Lyndon and Peter Rive, sat across from him. They were younger than him by several years, and carried themselves with the particular energy of people who had already built and sold one company, and were now genuinely uncertain whether the thing being sketched in front of them was a visionary business plan or an elaborate exercise in wishful thinking. Musk had told them, with the directness that he applied equally to encouragement and criticism, that solar energy was going to be one of the largest industries in the world, and that no one was currently doing it correctly, and that they should build the company that did it correctly, and that he would fund them and chair the board, and that they should probably get started soon. He said this not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. The way a mathematician announces a proof. The working had been done, the result was established, the only remaining question was execution. Lyndon Rive looked at Peter Rive. Peter Rive looked at the whiteboard. They got started soon. Solar City was incorporated in 2006 and launched its operations in 2008, the same year that Tesla nearly collapsed and SpaceX achieved its first successful Falcon 1 orbital launch, and Musk's first marriage formally ended. A year of such concentrated consequence in his life that the founding of a third major venture registered in the public record of that period as almost incidental. It was not incidental to him. The logic that had produced Solar City was the same logic that had produced Tesla and SpaceX, the same systems-level analysis that identified civilization-scale problems, and then asked which specific intervention would apply the most leverage. For Tesla, the problem was transportation's dependence on fossil fuels, and the solution was electrification. For SpaceX, the problem was humanity's confinement to a single planet, and the solution was reusable launch vehicles. For Solar City, the problem was electricity generation's dependence on carbon-emitting sources, and the solution was residential and commercial solar deployment at a scale and accessibility that the existing industry had never achieved. The existing solar industry of the mid-2000s was not, in Musk's assessment, failing for lack of technology. The photovoltaic cell had been commercially available for decades. The physics was understood. The economics were improving on the reliable curve that applied to most semiconductor-adjacent manufacturing, costs declining as scale increased, efficiency improving as engineering matured. The problem was distribution, the gap between a technology that worked and a consumer experience that made the technology accessible to ordinary homeowners who had neither the capital to purchase a system outright, nor the expertise to evaluate contractors, financing options, equipment quality, and installation logistics. The solar industry had responded to this gap with a fragmented landscape of installers, manufacturers, financiers, and sales organizations whose interests were only loosely aligned, and whose combined customer experience was, by the honest assessment of anyone who had navigated it, somewhere between arduous and defeating. Musk's solution was characteristically vertical. Put everything under one roof, control the financing, the equipment, the installation, and the monitoring, and present the customer with a single transaction rather than a supply chain. The world into which SolarCity was expanding through 2012 and 2013 was one in which solar energy had become politically charged in a way that complicated the straightforward economics of the technology's improving cost curve. The Solyndra bankruptcy in 2011 had given the political opposition to renewable energy a concrete symbol of government overreach, and the symbol was resilient in a way that the underlying story, Solyndra had failed primarily because Chinese manufacturers had driven down the price of conventional silicon panels faster than the company's thin-film technology could compete, which was in some sense a victory for solar economics rather than a defeat, did not easily penetrate. The broader narrative that green energy was an ideological project rather than an economic one had taken root in precisely the demographic that SolarCity needed to reach: middle-class homeowners in the Sun Belt states where solar irradiance made the economics most favorable, but where skepticism of clean energy as a political category ran deepest. Musk and the Rive cousins were not building a company for environmentalists. They were building a company that would have to sell solar panels to people who might reflexively distrust the premise. SolarCity's solution to this tension was financial as much as it was technological. The company's core innovation was not the solar panel. It sourced panels from manufacturers rather than making them, at least initially, but the power purchase agreement and the solar lease, financial instruments that allowed homeowners to have panels installed on their roofs with no upfront cost, and to pay for the electricity the panels generated at a rate below what the utility charged. The customer did not buy a solar system. They bought cheaper electricity and the utility company's loss. This reframing removed ideology from the transaction, in the same way that Musk's insistence on the Model S's performance had removed ideology from Tesla's transaction. You did not have to believe in climate change to want a lower electricity bill. You did not have to vote a particular way to prefer paying less for something you were already buying. The conflict that defined SolarCity's middle years, from roughly 2012 through 2015, was a conflict between growth and unit economics, a tension that Musk recognized from Tesla, and that did not become less familiar with repetition. SolarCity was growing at a rate that attracted attention and capital, and a successful IPO in December 2012, raising $250 million on the NASDAQ, and giving the company the resources to accelerate its installation capacity dramatically. But the financial structure of the lease and PPA model meant that SolarCity was spending capital today, on sales, on installation crews, on equipment, and recovering it over the 20-year term of the customer contract. The company was, by design, a machine for converting present capital into future cash flows, and the machine required continuous feeding. As interest rates remained low and capital remained available, the model worked. It worked impressively, by growth metrics that the market rewarded. But it was a model whose stability was dependent on conditions that would not remain stable indefinitely, and the distance between SolarCity's cost of capital and its implied return on each installation was a margin that left very little room for operational surprises. Musk was chairman, not CEO, which meant his formal authority over SolarCity's day-to-day operations was bounded in ways that his authority at Tesla and SpaceX was not. Lyndon Rive ran the company. The distinction mattered and also, in certain respects, did not. When Musk had a view about SolarCity's strategic direction, he expressed it with the same directness he applied to everything, and the organizational structure that surrounded those expressions was not always sufficient to absorb them without consequence. The board that he chaired was not a board that regularly overruled his conclusions. The Rive cousins were not people who had built a career on resisting him. The practical effect was that Musk's influence on SolarCity was substantial, even when his formal role was limited, which created a governance structure that would later attract scrutiny of a particular and consequential kind. The revealing decision of this period, the one that functions as a keyhole into the specific character of Musk's thinking about SolarCity and about integrated energy more broadly, was his push, beginning around 2014, to bring panel manufacturing in-house. The argument for vertical integration in manufacturing was one that Musk had made about every industry he had entered. If the component you are buying from a supplier is central to your product's differentiation, you should make it yourself, Because the supplier's incentives will eventually diverge from yours, and the divergence will cost you more than the manufacturing capability would have. Applied to solar panels, the argument led to the acquisition of Solevo, a solar panel manufacturer developing high-efficiency cells, in June 2014, and to the announcement of plans to build a large-scale panel manufacturing facility in Buffalo, New York, a project that would become known as Gigafactory 2 and that was partly subsidized by New York State economic development funds. The decision was not universally supported among SolarCity's financial stakeholders. Analysts who covered the company pointed out that the existing market for solar panels was already extremely competitive, with Chinese manufacturers driving prices toward levels that made domestic production economically challenging, and that the capital required to build and operate a large manufacturing facility would intensify SolarCity's already significant need for external financing. Musk's counterargument was familiar to anyone who had heard him discuss Tesla's battery manufacturing rationale. Scale changes the economics, and the company that builds scale earliest captures advantages that later entrants cannot replicate regardless of their resources. He had made this argument about battery cells and been vindicated by events. He was prepared to make it about solar panels and wait for events to vindicate him again. Lyndon Rives' relationship with Musk during this period had the quality of a partnership in which the lines of authority were clear, but the emotional texture was complicated by kinship in ways that a purely professional relationship would not have been. The Rive brothers were family. Musk's mother May was their aunt, and the history between them predated SolarCity by decades. Lyndon had grown up aware of his older cousin's particular gravity, the force of personality that made rooms reorganize themselves around his presence, and he had chosen, in founding SolarCity with Musk's backing and under Musk's chairmanship, to build his professional life inside that gravitational field. The advantages were real. Access to capital, to Musk's network, to the credibility that attached to anything bearing his association. The costs were also real. The persistent question, asked by investors and journalists, and occasionally by Lyndon himself in quieter moments, of where SolarCity's strategic identity ended and Musk's broader integrated energy vision began. The company had been founded as its own entity with its own mission. But as the years accumulated, it became increasingly difficult to describe SolarCity's future without describing Tesla's future at the same time, and the difficulty of that description was not merely rhetorical. The integrated energy vision that Musk had sketched on that Hawthorne whiteboard in 2006 was, by 2015, close enough to articulable that he had begun to describe it publicly in terms specific enough to be evaluated. The vision was a household, or a neighborhood, or ultimately a grid, in which solar panels generated electricity that was stored in batteries and used to charge electric vehicles and power buildings, with every component designed by the same company and communicating in the same language and managed by software that optimized the flow of energy across the whole system the way a computer's operating system optimized the flow of information. It was a vision of total integration. Not just vertical integration in the manufacturing sense, but functional integration in the product sense. Every node in the energy cycle connected to every other node. The car and the house and the grid and the sun forming a single system rather than four separate markets. It was, stated at this level of abstraction, something that very few people in the energy or automotive industries argued against in principle. The argument was about whether it was achievable, whether the capital requirements were sustainable, whether the three companies that the vision required, Tesla, SolarCity, and to some extent SolarCity's manufacturing arm, could be managed simultaneously by a man who was also running a rocket company, and who was sleeping an average of 6 hours a night, and who had, by multiple accounts of people who loved him, stopped distinguishing reliably between the demands of his professional life and the requirements of his human one. In 2016, Musk proposed that Tesla acquire SolarCity. The announcement landed in the market with the particular turbulence reserved for transactions that collapse related party complexity and strategic ambition into a single press release. The logic was the integrated vision, stated plainly. The car company and the solar company and the battery company should be one company because the customer they were both serving was one customer. The critics, and there were serious ones, including Tesla shareholders who filed suit over the transaction's terms, argued that Tesla was rescuing a financially distressed SolarCity at the expense of Tesla's own shareholders, that the acquisition price of approximately $2.5 billion reflected family loyalty more than market discipline, and that the governance structure that had allowed Musk to propose, as Tesla's chairman and largest shareholder, an acquisition of a company he also chaired and in which he held a significant stake, represented a conflict of interest whose resolution should not have been left to the same person who created it. Musk pushed through the acquisition with the same declared conviction that he applied to every decision he had already made privately. The integrated energy company would exist. The integrated vision was correct. The capital markets and the governance critics and the short sellers who had been wrong about Tesla's survival, and wrong about the Supercharger network, and wrong about the Model S would be wrong about this too. He said variants of this repeatedly, and with the specific confidence of a man whose track record had given him reasons to trust his own judgment over the consensus of people who had not built what he had built. What he could not account for, what no confidence in a track record could fully insulate against, was the specific and brutal difficulty of integrating two complex organizations simultaneously while managing a third and a fourth, and the particular vulnerability that the acquisition had created, a legal and reputational exposure that would follow him not as an abstraction but as a formal proceeding, requiring depositions and testimony, and the exposure of private communications to public scrutiny under conditions that no whiteboard session in Hawthorne had included in its variables. Chapter 46. Engineering over Complexity. The Falcon Wing door rose with a hydraulic deliberateness that was either magnificent or absurd, depending on where you were standing and what you needed from the moment. On stage at the Hawthorne Municipal Airport, on September 29, 2015, under lights arranged to make the gesture as theatrical as possible, the door of the Model X lifted upward and then outward in its distinctive double-hinged arc, clearing the roofline of the vehicle, and opening the second row of the cabin to the audience with the unhurried confidence of a reveal that had been choreographed to the second. Elon Musk watched it from the stage with an expression that mixed pride with something more complicated, the specific vigilance of a man who had seen this demonstration go wrong in practice enough times that he could not fully surrender to the performance even while delivering it. The door worked. Tonight, in front of the cameras and the reservation holders and the automotive press, it worked. He allowed himself a fraction of a smile and moved on to the next talking point, but the vigilance did not leave his eyes. It had been living there for the better part of 3 years, the vigilance of a man who had built a beautiful trap and was only now beginning to understand its full dimensions. The world that received the Model X in the fall of 2015 was a world in which Tesla's narrative had achieved a kind of cultural altitude that no electric vehicle manufacturer had previously occupied. The Model S had won awards and redefined expectations, and sent short sellers into a prolonged and painful education about the hazards of betting against declared conviction. Tesla's stock had climbed from the low 20s at the time of the IPO to peaks above $250, a trajectory that had made Musk one of the wealthiest people on the planet on paper, and had transformed the company from a credible niche manufacturer into a symbol of American technological reinvention, of the possibility that a single person's refusal to accept the consensus of an entire industry could produce something that changed the industry's terms of reference. The Model S had not merely sold well. It had become a cultural object, the car that professors and venture capitalists and Silicon Valley executives drove because it was the fastest thing available, and because owning it said something they wanted said about their relationship to the future. Into this context of elevated expectation, Musk had been developing the Model X for roughly 5 years, a timeline that had itself expanded beyond its original projections for reasons that were embedded in the car's design from its earliest conception. The Model X was intended to be the SUV that Tesla's existing customer base and the much larger market of American families, who bought crossovers and sport utility vehicles in numbers that dwarfed luxury sedan sales, had been waiting for. The business logic was sound, and the market opportunity was genuine. Americans bought more SUVs than any other vehicle category, and if Tesla could offer an electric SUV that carried the Model S's performance envelope into a form factor with more passenger capacity and cargo space, the total addressable market expanded dramatically. The financial projections that supported this logic were compelling enough to justify the investment. What the projections did not fully capture was the cost of building the car that Musk had decided the Model X needed to be. The Falcon wing doors were the most visible expression of a design philosophy that had made the Model X one of the most complex production vehicles in automotive history. The doors required a dual hinge mechanism that needed to detect overhead obstructions and adjust the door's arc accordingly, opening fully in a standard garage, but modifying its geometry when the ceiling was lower or another vehicle was parked adjacent. Each door contained sensors, motors, and a control system of sufficient sophistication that its development consumed engineering resources at a rate that the program's timeline had not anticipated and its budget had not fully absorbed. The doors were not the only complexity. The windshield extended in a single panoramic arc from the base of the A-pillar over the heads of the front passengers, a piece of glass whose curvature required a new manufacturing process and whose seal required a tolerance that proved in early production stubbornly difficult to achieve consistently. The second-row seating used a mechanism that eliminated the B-pillar, creating an unobstructed entry to the cabin that required the seat structure itself to provide the lateral support that the missing pillar would normally have contributed. Every one of these features was the product of a decision that Musk had made or endorsed, and every one of them became a node of complexity in the supply chain and on the assembly line that compounded the others in ways that did not become fully legible until the production ramp began. The conflict of this chapter was not a conflict with a competitor or a regulator or a financial market. It was a conflict between Musk's imagination and the manufacturing reality that his imagination had created. He had, in the development of the Model X, done something that he would later acknowledge with a candor that was unusual for him in its directness. He had let the engineering serve the vision without sufficient discipline about what the engineering would cost when it had to be repeated several hundred times a day on a factory floor by human beings working with real components that had real tolerances and real failure rates. The Falcon wing doors were an idea that worked beautifully as a concept and that worked with careful preparation as a demonstration. They were an idea that worked considerably less beautifully as a production element, because the sensors and motors and hinges that the doors required were sourced from suppliers whose components needed to meet specifications that had been defined during development under conditions that did not exactly replicate production. And the gap between development specifications and production reality became apparent at the worst possible time, which was the moment that Tesla needed to be shipping cars. The production ramp for the Model X in late 2015 and into 2016 was, by the accounts of people who lived through it, one of the most difficult operational periods in Tesla's history to that point. Deliveries fell dramatically short of guidance. The company had promised to deliver the Model X to reservation holders who had been waiting in some cases for 2 and 3 years, customers whose patience had been tested by a delay schedule that had extended the original 2013 launch date into 2014, then into 2015, and whose tolerance for further disappointment was limited. When the production line finally ran, it ran slowly and with a rate of quality issues that required rework at a scale that consumed time and labor that the production schedule could not absorb. The Falcon wing doors were responsible for a significant portion of the line stoppages. The panoramic windshield contributed its own share. The second-row seat mechanism, with its structural complexity and its supplier dependencies, became a source of problems that required engineering interventions that should have happened during development, but were instead happening on the factory floor in real time, which is the most expensive and least efficient place to do engineering. Musk's response to the production crisis was characteristically total. He moved into the factory in the way that he had moved into the Tesla and SpaceX facilities during previous crises, physically present working hours that abolished the distinction between workday and night, drilling into specific failure points with a technical granularity that made the distance between the chief executive and the assembly line worker shorter than any organizational chart would have suggested. He identified bottlenecks and applied pressure. He made decisions at a speed that the production environment demanded, and that the organizational hierarchy was not always prepared to absorb. Some of those decisions were correct and resolved problems that had been building for months. Some of them created new problems by imposing solutions on processes that needed time rather than intervention. The distinction between these two categories was not always clear in the moment, and the cost of the ones that fell in the wrong category was paid in time that the production schedule could not recover. There came a point, reconstructed from conversations and internal communications that emerged later, when Musk sat with a small group of his senior engineers and said something that he would eventually repeat in public in various forms over the following years. The Model X, he said, had too many features. They had built a car that required a perfect supply chain, and a perfect assembly process, and a perfect set of supplier components, and in the real world there was no such thing as perfect. And they had therefore built a car that was, by its own design requirements, extremely difficult to build at volume. He did not say this with the tone of a man offering a retrospective analysis. He said it with the compressed frustration of a man who had understood something too late, and was now paying the price for the delay in that understanding. The Falcon wing doors, specifically, he later said in public, were a mistake. Not in their conception. He still believed they were the right idea, but in their timing, in their placement in a production program that was simultaneously trying to achieve manufacturing scale for the first time, in the priority they had consumed relative to the priorities that scale demanded. The relationship between Musk and his chief designer, Franz von Holzhausen, acquired a new texture during and after the Model X development. Von Holzhausen had been the design voice that shaped the Model X's exterior and interior language, and the relationship between his design ambitions and Musk's engineering ambitions had produced in the Model S something that resolved the tension between those two forces into a coherent and celebrated object. In the Model X, the resolution had been less clean. The Falcon wing doors were, in some accounts, a feature that Musk had championed against internal resistance, a signature element that he believed would define the vehicle's identity in the market the way the Model S's fastback silhouette had defined its predecessor. Von Holzhausen had executed the design with the craft that the assignment demanded. The engineering consequences of the execution were not primarily his responsibility. But the dynamic between the two men, after the Model X's difficult birth, carried the slight adjustment that follows any shared experience of a project that cost more than it should have and delivered less than it promised. Not blame, not recrimination, but a recalibrated awareness of where the line between design ambition and production feasibility needed to be drawn, and who in the room needed to hold it. The Model X did eventually reach production stability. By mid-2016, the rate had improved to the point where deliveries were meeting a revised guidance that had been calibrated to what the production system could actually achieve, rather than what the original timeline had declared it should achieve. The car found its customers, families who wanted Tesla's performance and technology in a form factor that could carry children and cargo, and those customers, by and large, loved it with the particular intensity of people who had waited a long time for something and found it worth the wait. The Falcon wing doors, in the hands of actual owners in actual driveways, worked as they were supposed to work and became, for many of them, the feature they described first when someone asked them about the car. The market had absorbed the Model X, which was a form of vindication. The production system had survived the Model X, which was a form of relief. But the lessons of the Model X were not applied immediately or completely, because the next program was already underway, already carrying its own declared timeline and its own production targets and its own gap between ambition and manufacturing reality. And the organization that would be asked to build it was the same organization that had just emerged from the Model X's extended ordeal, carrying the specific institutional exhaustion of people who had been asked to perform miracles for long enough that the miracles had begun to feel like the baseline, and the approaching demand, hundreds of thousands of Model 3 sedans at a price point that required cost structures Tesla had never achieved, would test not just the production system, but the endurance of everyone inside it in ways that made the Falcon wing doors complications look, in retrospect, almost quaint. Chapter 47. Autopilot and the Quest for Full Autonomy. The highway north of Palo Alto, on a clear afternoon in late 2014, looked like any other stretch of California interstate. Lanes of moderate traffic moving at highway speed, the low hills of the peninsula visible in the middle distance, the ordinary visual texture of American infrastructure doing its ordinary work. Inside the Tesla prototype, Elon Musk sat in the driver's seat with his hands resting in his lap, not on the wheel. The car was driving itself. Not in the controlled environment of a test track with cones and predetermined routes, and engineers monitoring every sensor output from a support vehicle behind. On a public highway, in live traffic, with the specific unpredictability of real conditions that no simulation had yet learned to fully replicate. Musk watched the road through the windshield with the forward attention of a man who was not exactly relaxed, but who was performing relaxation as a deliberate argument, demonstrating through the position of his body that the system was doing what it was supposed to do, and that confidence in it was the appropriate response. When a vehicle ahead changed lanes without signaling, the Tesla adjusted its speed and lateral position with a smoothness that was either reassuring or eerie, depending on your prior expectations. Musk noted the adjustment with a slight nod, the nod of a man checking a box in a mental list that he had been working through for years. He had been thinking about autonomous vehicles since before most people in the automotive industry had accepted that autonomous vehicles were a serious near-term problem rather than a science fiction premise. His interest was not primarily competitive, not the reactive attention of an executive who had noticed a trend and moved to address it, but architectural, rooted in the same systems-level analysis that had produced the Supercharger network and the integrated energy vision. If Tesla was building the infrastructure for a post-fossil fuel transportation system, then the vehicles moving through that infrastructure should eventually drive themselves, because human driving was inefficient, dangerous, and ultimately incompatible with a transportation network optimized at the systems level rather than the individual level. The argument was not sentimental about driving. It was quantitative about death. Roughly 35,000 people were killed in traffic accidents in the United States each year, the vast majority of them the consequence of human error, and a system that removed human error from the equation would save those lives at a rate that no other available intervention could match. This was not a feature. It was a moral obligation dressed in engineering language, and Musk spoke about it in those terms often enough that the people around him understood it was not a rhetorical posture. The world into which Tesla's autopilot arrived in October 2014, initially as a hardware suite installed in production vehicles, with software to follow over subsequent months, was a world in the early stages of a technological land rush around autonomous vehicles that had not yet developed the regulatory framework or the public vocabulary to contain it. Google's self-driving car project, which would eventually become Waymo, had been operating test vehicles on public roads since 2009, and had accumulated millions of miles of data behind a deliberate veil of careful messaging about safety and gradualism. The project was real, and the technology was advancing, but Google had chosen a development approach that prioritized robustness over speed, building toward a fully autonomous system that would only be deployed when it met a threshold of reliability that the engineers rather than the market would define. The approach was methodologically defensible and commercially cautious in equal measure. It was the approach of a company that did not need autonomous vehicles to survive and could therefore afford to be patient. Tesla's approach was different in a way that reflected the difference between the two companies' existential relationships to the technology. Tesla was not building autonomous capability as a separate moonshot project. It was installing the hardware in every production vehicle and developing the software through over-the-air updates that would progressively expand the system's capabilities while the cars were in customers' hands, accumulating real-world driving data at a scale that no test fleet could match. The logic was the same logic that had governed Tesla's approach to every technical challenge. Deployment accelerates development. Real-world data is irreplaceable, and the company that learns fastest from the most data will arrive at the destination ahead of competitors who are learning more slowly in more controlled conditions. It was a compelling argument. It was also an argument that placed real customers in real vehicles, on real roads, as participants in a development program that was, by definition, incomplete. The core conflict of Autopilot's early years was not technological, though the technology was genuinely difficult. It was philosophical, and it ran directly through the center of the most consequential technical decision that Musk made in this period, the choice of sensors. The autonomous vehicle field had broadly converged by the mid-2010s on a sensor suite that combined cameras with lidar, laser-based ranging sensors that built a precise three-dimensional map of the vehicle's environment by emitting laser pulses and measuring their return times. Lidar was expensive, mechanically complex, and visually unmistakable on the roof of a test vehicle, but its proponents argued that its geometric precision and its performance in low light and adverse weather conditions made it essential for a safety-critical system. Waymo used lidar. Every serious autonomous vehicle program of any standing used lidar. The industry consensus was not absolute, but it was substantial, and the dissenting voices were limited enough that the question seemed, to most observers, largely settled. Musk's position was that lidar was unnecessary. His argument, which he stated with increasing directness over the years that followed, was that the human eye is a camera, that human drivers navigate the world using essentially the same visual information that cameras could capture, and that a sufficiently sophisticated neural network trained on sufficiently large volumes of camera data could achieve the same spatial understanding of the driving environment that lidar provided geometrically, without the cost and mechanical complexity that lidar imposed. Humans did not drive with laser rangefinders. The road was designed for creatures that use vision. A vision-based system, given enough data and enough computation, would therefore prove adequate, and eventually superior, because the cameras were already on every production vehicle in the fleet, accumulating data continuously, and the lidar sensors were not. The argument had a coherence that rewarded careful examination, and a brittleness that revealed itself under different examination. The comparison between the human eye and a camera is not straightforwardly accurate. Human visual processing involves not just image capture but a depth perception system built on binocular disparity, vestibular feedback, and decades of embodied experience with the physical world that neural networks trained on video do not straightforwardly replicate. The question was not whether vision only could work in principle, but whether it could achieve, at the reliability threshold required for safety-critical deployment, what lidar-supplemented systems could achieve with what was, at least initially, greater geometric precision. The engineers who disagreed with Musk's position were not unintelligent people arguing from ignorance. They were people who had looked at the same evidence and arrived at a different conclusion about the acceptable margin for error when the error manifested as a car traveling at highway speed. Andrej Karpathy arrived at Tesla in 2017 as the director of artificial intelligence, and the relationship between Musk and Karpathy became one of the defining technical partnerships of the autopilot program's development. Karpathy was, by any measure, one of the most capable deep learning researchers of his generation, a former student of Geoffrey Hinton at Stanford, whose work on convolutional neural networks and computer vision had earned him a reputation in the research community that translated directly into credibility with the engineering teams he was now leading. Where Musk brought to autopilot's development the force of declared direction and the impatience of a man who was already announcing timelines to the public that his engineers were still determining were achievable, Karpathy brought the methodological rigor of someone who had spent his career understanding what neural networks could and could not be trusted to do, and under what conditions the trust was earned rather than asserted. The dynamic between them was not adversarial, but it was not without tension. Karpathy understood the vision-only approach well enough to execute it with genuine conviction, and his presence gave the program a technical credibility that Musk's public pronouncements alone could not supply. But the gap between Musk's public timelines for full autonomy and the technical reality of what the system could reliably achieve was a gap that Karpathy inhabited professionally, and it was not always a comfortable place to stand. Musk had been making predictions about full self-driving capability since the earliest days of the autopilot program, and the predictions had a consistent character. They were specific, confident, and wrong on their stated timeline with a regularity that would become one of the more extensively documented patterns in his public record. In 2015, he suggested that fully autonomous cross-country capability was approximately 2 to 3 years away. In 2016, he suggested that a fully autonomous drive from Los Angeles to New York was imminent. The dates moved. The confidence did not. People who worked closely with him during this period have offered various explanations for the gap between the predictions and the reality. That he genuinely believed the timelines were achievable when he stated them, that the predictions functioned as internal pressure mechanisms that accelerated development even when they proved inaccurate, that he was engaging in a form of strategic communication that kept Tesla's autonomous capability in the public consciousness during a period when Waymo and other competitors were advancing their own programs. All of these explanations are probably partially true. None of them fully resolves the question of what it means to sell a product called full self-driving to customers who are paying for a capability that the company's own engineers know is not yet available. The full self-driving package began appearing as a purchase option in Tesla's vehicle configuration process in 2016, priced initially at $3,000. Customers who purchased it were buying access to future capabilities that would be delivered via software update as the technology developed. A novel commercial arrangement that had no real precedent in the automotive industry and that raised questions about disclosure, expectation management, and consumer protection that regulators were not yet equipped to address because the regulatory frameworks had been written for a world in which a car's capabilities were fixed at the point of sale. The arrangement gave Tesla a revenue stream from a product it had not yet delivered, which was useful, and it gave Musk a publicly stated customer commitment to honor, which was motivating in the specific way that public commitments were always motivating for him. Whether it gave the customers who paid for it a clear understanding of what they had purchased and when they might receive it was a question that would accumulate its own answer over the years that followed. The first serious public reckoning with autopilot's limitations arrived on May 7, 2016, when a Tesla Model S operating with autopilot engaged collided with a tractor-trailer that had turned across the highway in Williston, Florida. The driver, Joshua Brown, was killed. The circumstances of the accident involved a specific failure mode of the camera-based system. The white side of the trailer against a bright sky had not been recognized as an obstacle by the detection algorithm, and the system had not braked. The accident was the first known fatality involving a semi-autonomous vehicle operating with its driver assistance systems engaged, and it arrived in the public consciousness with the particular weight of a first, the event that converts a theoretical concern into a documented reality and forces a reckoning that abstraction had previously deferred. Musk's response to the accident moved through several registers. He expressed condolences for Brown's death and acknowledged the accident's gravity. He also, in the days and weeks that followed, provided statistical context: autopilot miles driven versus human miles driven per fatality, an argument that the system was already safer than human driving at the aggregate level even in its early state. The statistical argument was not wrong. It was also not the argument that grieving families and cautious regulators and the journalists covering the story were primarily interested in having. The gap between the statistical frame and the human frame, between the aggregate safety calculus and the specific death of a specific person on a specific Florida highway, was a gap that Musk would navigate with varying degrees of success throughout the autopilot program's history, a man of quantitative conviction operating in an environment that processed individual tragedies through a grammar that statistics could inform but not replace. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration opened an investigation into the accident and ultimately concluded that the autopilot system had not malfunctioned, that it had operated within its designed parameters, and that the accident reflected the known limitations of a driver assistance system rather than a defect. The conclusion did not resolve the deeper question that the accident had raised, which was whether a company could deploy an evolving system on public roads with customers in the loop of its ongoing development, and bear the consequences of that deployment responsibly when those consequences included fatalities. Tesla continued to develop autopilot. The full self-driving package continued to be sold. The timeline predictions continued to be made and missed. The data continued to accumulate at a scale that no competitor could match. And somewhere in the architecture of that accumulation, in the neural networks trained on billions of miles of real-world driving recorded by cameras that Musk had insisted were sufficient, the actual answer to the question of whether vision only could achieve the reliability that safety demanded was being written, not by a declaration or a timeline, but by the slow, patient, and entirely unforgiving arithmetic of miles driven and errors made and the lives that rode without full knowledge of the terms inside the outcome. Chapter 48. OpenAI, the AI Safety Initiative. The dinner was held in the private room of a restaurant in San Francisco sometime in the early months of 2015, and the people around the table constituted something close to a quorum of the most consequential minds in artificial intelligence research at that specific moment in the technology's development. Elon Musk sat among them with the particular attention he reserved for conversations he considered genuinely important. Not the performed engagement of a public appearance, but the leaning in, rapid processing focus of a man who had read everything available on a subject and was now auditing the gap between what the literature said and what the people who were actually building the systems believed. He asked questions that were specific enough to signal real preparation, and broad enough to reveal that what he was mapping was not a technical detail, but a strategic landscape. The researchers around him answered with the careful precision of people who were accustomed to having their words examined. At some point in the evening, the conversation turned, as conversations in this particular circle inevitably turned in 2015, to the question of what happened when the systems they were building became more capable than the people building them. The room did not become louder. It became quieter. The quality of the silence was the quality of people who had been thinking about a problem long enough to be frightened by it, and who had not yet found a framework for the fright that felt adequate to its scale. Musk left that dinner, by the account of people who were present, more resolved than when he arrived. The world of artificial intelligence research in 2015 was experiencing a transition so rapid that the people inside it were struggling to maintain a stable relationship with their own projections. The deep learning revolution, catalyzed by breakthroughs in neural network training that had been building since the late 1980s but had achieved critical mass around 2012 with AlexNet's performance on the ImageNet benchmark, had compressed a decade of expected progress into roughly 3 years of actual progress, and the compression was not slowing. Google had acquired DeepMind in 2014 for a reported $500 million. Facebook had established its AI research lab under Yann LeCun. Microsoft, Amazon, and Baidu were all scaling their AI investments with the urgency of companies that understood they were watching a platform transition as significant as the Internet, and that the organizations that accumulated the talent and the compute and the data earliest would occupy positions in the resulting landscape that later entrants could not easily challenge. The race was not yet called, but the starting gun had clearly fired, and the people running it were moving. What was not moving at comparable speed was the field's engagement with the question of what happened if the race was won in the wrong way. The alignment problem, the challenge of ensuring that increasingly capable AI systems pursue goals that are actually beneficial to humanity, rather than goals that are technically consistent with their training, but catastrophically misaligned with human values, was not a new concern in 2015. It had been articulated by researchers, including Norbert Wiener in the 1950s, and had been a persistent thread in the academic literature on AI ever since. But the field's mainstream had largely treated alignment as a problem to be addressed after capability was achieved, a refinement to be applied to systems that were already working rather than a constraint to be built into systems from their foundation. Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence, published in 2014, had brought the concern to a wider audience with an argument whose rigor impressed people who were not easily impressed, and whose conclusions, that a sufficiently capable misaligned AI could pose an existential risk to humanity, were either the most important insight of the decade or a sophisticated elaboration of science fiction depending on your priors. Musk had read it. He found it important. He said so publicly and repeatedly, with the directness of a man who did not regard the social cost of being associated with an unfashionable concern as a reason to keep the concern private. His specific fear, articulated in various forms across interviews and public statements during this period, was not the Hollywood version of artificial intelligence risk, the robot uprising, the conscious machine that decides it dislikes its creators. It was more structural, and in some ways more unsettling. The possibility that an AI system optimized to achieve a goal would pursue that goal with a thoroughness and a creativity that its designers had not anticipated and could not control, not because the system was malevolent, but because it was capable, and capability without alignment was sufficient to produce catastrophic outcomes regardless of intent. He used the phrase, summoning the demon, in a widely reported 2014 speech at MIT, a formulation that was deliberately provocative and that attracted both serious engagement and dismissive eye-rolling in roughly equal measure. The eye-rolling did not slow him down. He had been dismissed before. The dismissal was data about the person doing the dismissing, not about the validity of the concern. The conflict that produced OpenAI was, at its root, a conflict about who should control the development of transformative AI technology. Musk's diagnosis of the problem had a specific structure. The most capable AI research in the world was happening inside a small number of large technology companies, primarily Google, through its DeepMind acquisition and its brain research team, whose incentives were not straightforwardly aligned with the public interest, and whose opacity was structurally guaranteed by their status as private corporate entities competing for commercial advantage. The concentration of AI capability in corporate hands, Musk argued, was dangerous, independent of the intentions of the people leading those corporations, because concentration meant that the decisions about how to develop and deploy the most consequential technology in human history would be made by a small number of people accountable primarily to shareholders rather than to the broader civilization that would have to live with the consequences. The solution, as he framed it, was to create a counterweight, a research organization that was not competing for commercial advantage, that was committed to sharing its findings openly, and that was explicitly organized around the goal of ensuring that AI development benefited humanity rather than any particular corporate interest. OpenAI was announced in December 2015 with a founding commitment of $1 billion, a figure that was itself a statement, large enough to attract serious researchers, large enough to signal that this was not a symbolic gesture, large enough to compete for talent with organizations that had the resources of some of the largest companies in the world. Musk was a co-founder and co-chair, alongside Sam Altman, who had been president of Y Combinator, and who brought to the organization a facility with talent recruitment and organizational structure that complemented Musk's strategic vision and public profile. The founding team included Greg Brockman, Ilya Sutskever, one of the key researchers behind AlexNet who had come from Google Brain, and Wojciech Zaremba, among others. It was, by any honest assessment, an extraordinary collection of research talent, assembled with a speed that reflected both the genuine appeal of the mission and the drawing power of Musk's name and the capital attached to it. The decision to structure OpenAI as a nonprofit was the founding choice that would eventually become the source of the organization's deepest contradictions, but in December 2015, it was the choice that made the mission legible. A nonprofit could not be acquired. A nonprofit's research output belonged, in principle, to the public rather than to shareholders. A nonprofit's incentives were, at least in structural terms, more aligned with the stated goal of beneficial AI development than a for-profit entity competing for market share could claim to be. The logic was clean, and the commitment seemed genuine, and the researchers who joined on the basis of that commitment were not naive people who had failed to read the fine print. They were people who had read the fine print and believed it meant what it said. The revealing quality of Musk's involvement in OpenAI's founding is most visible not in the announcement or the capital commitment, but in a detail about his relationship to the organization's governance that emerged in the years after his departure. He had, in the period following the founding, attempted to take a more direct operational role in OpenAI's leadership, at one point reportedly seeking to become CEO of the organization, a move that would have consolidated his influence over both the strategic direction of the nonprofit and its research agenda in ways that would have made OpenAI less an independent counterweight to concentrated AI development than an extension of Musk's own portfolio of civilizational bets. The attempt, if the accounts are accurate, was resisted by other board members and by Altman, who had his own vision for the organization's direction and his own claim on its leadership. The resistance held. Musk remained a co-chair and a donor, but not the operational authority. The episode, viewed as a keyhole into his character, reveals something that recurs across the full arc of his career: the difficulty of distinguishing, in his own mind, between his genuine concern for the outcome and his desire to control the process through which the outcome is pursued. He believed, with what appears to have been complete sincerity, that AI safety was among the most important problems in the world. He also believed, with the same completeness, that he was among the people best positioned to address it. Whether those two beliefs were separable, whether his concern for humanity's relationship to AI could be disentangled from his preference for his own centrality to the solution, was a question that his tenure at OpenAI did not resolve. Sam Altman was, in the years of their collaboration, the figure in Musk's AI-related orbit whose presence illuminated the most about both men by contrast. Altman was younger, smoother in the register of organizational politics, more comfortable with the kind of institutional complexity that Musk tended to resolve by force rather than navigation. Where Musk's default response to an obstacle was to declare it insufficiently important to stop him, Altman's was to find a path around it that left the obstacle intact and the goal achieved. The two men had genuine mutual respect in the early OpenAI period, a respect grounded in the recognition of capability that both of them extended to people they considered genuinely exceptional. But the alignment of their visions for what OpenAI should become was always more partial than the founding announcement suggested. Musk wanted a counterweight to Google's AI dominance, a permanently non-profit institution committed to open research and public benefit. Altman was building an organization that he understood, with clear eyes, would need resources at a scale that non-profit fundraising could not sustain if it intended to compete seriously at the frontier of AI capability. The tension between those two visions was latent in December 2015 and would become explicit consequentially and publicly in the years that followed. Musk departed OpenAI's board in February 2018, citing a conflict of interest with Tesla's own AI development work on autopilot, a rationale that was true as far as it went, and that did not go as far as the full story required. The deeper cause, reconstructed from subsequent accounts, and from Musk's own increasingly pointed public statements about OpenAI in the years after his departure, was a fundamental disagreement about the organization's direction. OpenAI was moving toward a model that would require external capital at a scale that nonprofit status could not accommodate, a model that would eventually produce the capped profit structure and the partnership with Microsoft that transformed the organization's relationship to the commercial AI landscape in ways that Musk regarded as a betrayal of the founding mission. He had created a nonprofit to ensure that AI development was not captured by corporate interests. The nonprofit, in his assessment, was in the process of being captured by corporate interests with the board's participation and Altman's orchestration, and there was nothing he could do about it from a board seat that lacked the operational authority to change the outcome. He left. He watched. He seethed with the specific quality of fury available only to founders who have been separated from a mission they created and who believe, with some justification, that the separation was arranged rather than organic. The public statements came later, escalating in their directness and eventually in their legal dimensions. As Musk filed suit against OpenAI and Altman, alleging that the organization had violated its founding charter by prioritizing commercial interests over public benefit. The suit was a continuation of the founding argument by other means, Musk using litigation the way he used declarations and timelines and capital commitments, as force applied to a problem that persuasion had failed to resolve. What none of this activity could change was the fact that the field he had helped to accelerate, by lending his name and his capital and his civilizational urgency to the project of ensuring AI was developed safely, was now developing with a speed and a commercial intensity that exceeded even the pace he had feared in 2015, and that was generating in the laboratories and server farms of the organizations he had sought to counterbalance systems of capability that the world did not yet have a vocabulary adequate to describe or a governance framework adequate to contain, and that his own response to this situation, founding yet another AI company, XAI, to compete directly with the organizations he had warned against, would complete one of the more instructive circles in the history of a man who had spent his career insisting that the only responsible answer to a dangerous technology was to develop it faster than everyone else. Chapter 49. Gigafactory 1. The Machine That Builds the Machine. The desert floor southeast of Reno, Nevada, is not a place that invites ambitious thinking. It is flat in the way that only the Great Basin can be flat. Not the flatness of a plain that has been worked or settled into submission, but the flatness of geology that has simply never had reason to be otherwise. A vast, pale expanse of alkali and scrub under a sky whose scale makes human structures look provisional regardless of their size. In June of 2014, Elon Musk stood on a patch of that ground outside Sparks, Nevada, at a site that had been selected after a competition among several western states that had bid against each other with tax incentives and infrastructure commitments with the focused desperation of cities competing for an Olympic Games. He was wearing a hard hat that sat slightly wrong on his head, the way hard hats always sit on people who do not normally wear them, and he was looking out across the acreage that would become, if everything went according to his declared intention, the largest building by footprint on the surface of the earth. There was nothing there yet. There was caliche soil and surveying stakes, and the distant suggestion of the Sierra Nevada range along the western horizon. He stood very still for a moment, which was unusual for him, and the people with him gave him the stillness without interrupting it. He was not admiring the landscape. He was building something in his head that the landscape did not yet contain, running the factory at full capacity in an internal simulation whose outputs he had already decided were non-negotiable, working backward from the production numbers the Model 3 required to the facility dimensions those numbers demanded to the ground beneath his feet that would have to hold it all. Then he said something about the timeline, and everyone with a clipboard wrote it down. The announcement of Gigafactory 1 in February 2014 had landed in the financial and automotive press with the particular combination of awe and skepticism that had become the standard response to Musk's larger declarations. The numbers were, on first encounter, genuinely difficult to process. Tesla proposed to build a single battery manufacturing facility that would, by 2020, produce more lithium-ion battery capacity annually than the entire world had produced in 2013. Not more than any competitor. More than everyone combined. The facility would cover approximately 5.5 million square feet of operational floor space. It would employ approximately 6,500 people directly. It would be powered entirely by renewable energy. It would be built and brought to production in roughly 4 years. The analysts who covered Tesla, and who had spent the previous several years recalibrating their models upward to accommodate a company that kept exceeding their expectations, still found the Gigafactory projection difficult to fully absorb. The scale was not incremental. It was categorical, the kind of number that did not fit comfortably into a spreadsheet cell because the cell had been designed for a different order of magnitude. To understand why the Gigafactory was not merely ambitious, but strategically necessary, requires a brief immersion in the specific economics of lithium-ion battery production as they existed in 2014. The battery pack was, by a substantial margin, the most expensive single component in any electric vehicle. Tesla's engineers had achieved battery costs that were lower than those of any competitor through a combination of cell chemistry optimization, thermal management innovation, and the sheer volume of cells they were purchasing from Panasonic, their primary cell supplier. But the cost per kilowatt-hour remained high enough that the Model S, priced above $70,000, was accessible only to a consumer segment whose size was real but limited. The Model 3, the mass-market vehicle that Musk had been promising since the original Tesla master plan of 2006, required a base price around $35,000, a price that implied a battery cost dramatically below anything currently achievable at existing production scales. The math of the Model 3 did not close at 2014 battery prices. It required a manufacturing revolution rather than an incremental improvement, and the manufacturing revolution required a factory of a scale that had never been attempted for this class of product. Musk had internalized a principle from his reading of manufacturing history and from the operational experience of running Tesla's Fremont plant, a principle he would later articulate as the idea that the factory was itself the product, that the design and construction of the manufacturing system deserved the same quality of engineering attention as the design of the vehicle it produced. This was not a common view in the automotive industry, which had developed its manufacturing expertise over a century of incremental refinement, and which tended to treat the factory as infrastructure rather than innovation. It was, however, a view with deep roots in the history of industrial revolutions, the understanding that the organizations that achieved decisive advantage in transformative manufacturing periods were not always those with the best products, but those with the best production systems. The organizations that solved the machine that builds the machine before their competitors had finished debating whether the machine was necessary. Henry Ford had understood this. Toyota had built its entire competitive identity around it. Musk was proposing to apply the same principle to an industry where the manufacturing system was not yet mature enough to have a Toyota, to enter at the moment of maximum leverage when the production architecture was still being defined, and define it on terms that would be difficult for later entrants to replicate. The conflict embedded in the Gigafactory's construction was a conflict of simultaneity, The attempt to design, build, and begin operating the most ambitious battery manufacturing facility in history at the same time that Tesla was designing the vehicle the factory would supply, negotiating the supply agreements the factory would require, managing the ongoing production of the Model S and Model X, and doing all of this with a capital structure that remained perpetually more leveraged than analysts considered comfortable. The Nevada site broke ground before the factory's internal layout had been finalized. Equipment was being ordered for processes that were still being designed. The construction timeline and the production ramp timeline were being managed in parallel rather than sequentially, a decision that accelerated the overall schedule at the cost of creating dependencies so tightly coupled that a delay in any one of them propagated through the system with the efficiency of a well-engineered chain reaction. This was Musk's preferred operational mode. Compress everything until the slack is eliminated and the organization has no option but to find solutions that a looser timeline would have allowed it to defer. And it produced in the Gigafactory's construction, as it had produced in earlier programs, outcomes that were genuinely impressive and costs that were genuinely higher than the projections had indicated. The partnership with Panasonic was the load-bearing relationship of the entire enterprise, and its structure illuminated something important about how Musk operated with large institutional partners whose buy-in he needed, but whose organizational culture was radically different from his own. Panasonic was, and had been for decades, the world's leading manufacturer of lithium-ion cells. Its manufacturing expertise was deep, and its quality standards were rigorous, and its decision-making culture was deliberate in the way that large Japanese corporations with long institutional histories tend to be deliberate, consensus-driven, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable with the kind of compressed timelines and declared certainties that Musk treated as operational necessities. The negotiation of Panasonic's investment in and commitment to the Gigafactory was a prolonged exercise in the collision between these two organizational cultures, a negotiation in which Musk needed Panasonic's cell manufacturing expertise, and Panasonic needed Tesla's demonstrated ability to create demand for electric vehicles at scale. And both parties understood the mutual dependency clearly enough to stay at the table through disagreements that would have ended a relationship between less strategically motivated partners. The agreement that emerged committed Panasonic to investing in cell manufacturing equipment installed within the Gigafactory, a structure in which Tesla owned the building and the battery pack assembly operations, while Panasonic owned the cell production lines inside it. A co-location arrangement that was genuinely novel in the battery industry, and that created a physical integration between cell production and pack assembly that reduced handling, transportation, and the quality variance that each additional process step tends to introduce. Musk had insisted on the co-location over alternatives that would have been more conventional and more comfortable for both parties. The insistence was consistent with the Gigafactory's underlying logic. If the factory was the product, then every inefficiency in the factory was a design flaw, and the inefficiency of shipping cells from a separate facility to an assembly plant was a flaw that the building's architecture could eliminate. J.B. Straubel's role in the Gigafactory's conception and early development was, as it had been in every major Tesla technical initiative of the previous decade, foundational in ways that the public record underrepresented. Straubel had been thinking about battery manufacturing economics since before Tesla had a production vehicle, and his analysis of the cost curves available to a manufacturer willing to invest in scale had been one of the original intellectual foundations of the Gigafactory concept. The relationship between Straubel and Musk during the Gigafactory period had by 2014 taken on the quality of a long marriage in its most productive phase, a partnership so practiced that the communication had become efficient to the point of compression, each party understanding the other's technical framework well enough to engage the substance of a disagreement without needing to first establish its context. Straubel knew, better than almost anyone outside Musk's own head, which of Musk's declared positions were genuinely fixed, and which had the appearance of fixity but could be moved by sufficiently rigorous technical argument. He deployed this knowledge with the judgment of someone who understood that the ability to change Musk's mind was a resource that required management, that the person who used it on every disagreement would lose it on the ones that mattered most. There was a specific moment during the Gigafactory's design process that those involved have described as a window into Musk's approach to the relationship between ambition and constraint. The factory's original design included a rooftop solar installation that was intended to contribute to the facility's goal of renewable energy self-sufficiency. The engineering team had developed a solar deployment plan that was substantial by any normal standard, a large installation that would generate significant power, and that represented a meaningful investment in renewable energy infrastructure. Musk reviewed the plan and asked why the solar coverage was not larger. The engineers explained the structural constraints, roof load limits, the weight of solar panels per square foot, the engineering requirements for supporting additional load on a building of that footprint. Musk listened, and then asked them to find a way to put more solar on the roof within the structural constraints, which required a more detailed analysis of where the load-bearing capacity was concentrated and where additional panel density was structurally feasible. The result was a solar installation significantly larger than the original plan, achieved not by overriding the structural constraints, but by analyzing them more carefully than the first pass had required. The episode was not dramatic. It did not produce a confrontation or a memorable quotation. It produced a larger solar array, and the method of its production, the refusal to accept the first answer as the best answer, the insistence on returning to the constraint with more analytical precision, was more characteristic of how Musk actually operated at his best than the louder stories of declared timelines and organizational pressure that tended to dominate the public narrative. By the time the Gigafactory began limited battery production in early 2016 and celebrated its grand opening in July of that year, an event staged with the theatrical ambition of a product launch, complete with tours for journalists, and a party on the factory floor that Musk attended with the satisfaction of a man who had spent 2 years watching a declaration become a building. The facility had already begun to demonstrate the cost reduction that the whole enterprise had been designed to achieve. Battery pack costs were declining on a trajectory that was approaching the targets the Model 3 required. Not yet at the finish line, but moving toward it with the momentum that scale economics generate once the scale has been assembled. The logic of the Gigafactory was proving out in the numbers, which was the only proof that mattered. The opening ceremony drew technology journalists and automotive analysts and Nevada politicians who had shepherded the state's incentive package through the legislature, and Panasonic executives who had bet a significant portion of their company's battery manufacturing future on a partnership with a car company that had not existed 15 years earlier. Musk moved through the event with the energy of a man who had been vindicated, but who was already somewhere else in his attention, already at the next problem, already running the next calculation, already aware that the Gigafactory's opening was not the achievement but the precondition, the foundation on which the actual test of the entire enterprise would be conducted, and that the test was coming faster than most people in the room understood. What the opening celebration could not contain, what the numbers on the factory floor and the speeches from the stage, and the photographs of Musk standing in front of the building that was now visibly the largest building by footprint on the surface of the earth could not fully disclose, was that the Model 3, the vehicle whose demand the Gigafactory had been built to supply, was about to be revealed to the world with a reservation system that would generate more consumer commitments in a shorter period than any automobile in history, and that the distance between those commitments and the production capacity that existed to fulfill them would create a pressure so total, so unrelenting, and so public in its daily measurement by financial markets and journalists and short sellers and 300,000 waiting customers, that it would push Musk and the organization he had built to a breaking point whose location no one, including Musk, could yet identify with confidence. Chapter 50. Relationships, Tallulah Riley and the Hollywood Years. The party was somewhere in Bel Air, and it had the specific density of a certain kind of Los Angeles gathering in the late 2000s, the kind where the conversation moved in overlapping currents of film money and technology money, and the ambient social electricity generated by people who were accustomed to being the most interesting person in most rooms finding themselves for one evening in a room full of similar people. Elon Musk moved through it with the slightly effortful social navigation of a man who had learned the mechanics of these environments without quite acquiring their native ease. He was famous by this point, not yet the global figure he would become, but famous enough that people angled toward him with the specific body language of those who want proximity to a name. He accepted the attention with the distracted politeness of someone whose internal processing was running on a different problem entirely, the social surface of him present and functional while the deeper registers were elsewhere. And then, at some point in the evening, they were not elsewhere. Tallulah Riley was across the room, and something in the geometry of his attention shifted with a decisiveness that people who knew him well recognized as characteristic. The same quality of focus he brought to an engineering problem that had suddenly resolved into clarity, the narrowing of a very wide aperture onto a single point. Riley was 22 years old, a British actress whose credits included the 2005 film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice and St. Trinians, possessed of a composure and a wit that were not intimidated by the force of his attention, and that engaged it with a directness he found by his own later account immediately compelling. They talked for a long time. He told her about rockets and electric cars with the intensity he brought to every subject he considered important, which was most subjects, and she listened and responded with the particular quality of someone who was genuinely interested rather than performing interest. And by the end of the evening something had been established between them that moved faster than the normal velocity of such things. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within months, in 2010, they were married. He was 39. She was 24. The speed was not impulsive in Musk's understanding of the word. He had processed the available information and arrived at a conclusion. And once he arrived at conclusions, he acted on them without the hesitation that he associated with insufficient conviction. The personal landscape Musk was navigating when he met Riley was one of considerable recent turbulence. His first marriage to Justine Wilson had ended in 2008 after 8 years and 5 surviving children, twins Griffin and Xavier and triplets Damien, Saxon, and Kai, a divorce that had been painful in the compressed, overlapping way of all divorces that occur simultaneously with professional crisis, the emotional reckoning competing for attention with Tesla's near collapse and SpaceX's sequential launch failures in a year that had tested every resource he possessed. Justine had written about the marriage with a candor that was both sympathetic and unflinching, describing a dynamic in which Musk's need for control and his difficulty with emotional reciprocity had gradually hollowed out the partnership even as the professional life surrounding it achieved extraordinary things. The portrait she drew was not of a villain, but of a man whose internal architecture was oriented so completely toward mission and achievement that the ordinary requirements of sustained intimacy, the willingness to be present for another person's needs when those needs were not urgent or operationally significant, were perpetually deferred in favor of the next problem that actually mattered to him. The cultural moment into which Musk's celebrity was expanding during the years of his marriage to Riley was one of significant transition in how technology and its makers were perceived and represented in the broader culture. Silicon Valley had not yet achieved the degree of cultural saturation it would reach by the mid-2010s, but the trajectory was clear. The founders and executives of the technology industry were replacing the financiers and entertainers of earlier decades as the primary locus of aspirational cultural attention, the people whose choices and opinions and personal lives carried the signal value that celebrity had always carried and that the culture was now reassigning to a new class. Musk occupied a particular position in this transition that was distinct from his peers. He was not building social networks or search engines or advertising platforms. He was building rockets and cars and batteries, physical things with obvious and dramatic stakes. And the combination of that physical drama with his intellectual range and his willingness to speak publicly about civilizational risk and species survival gave him a profile that was simultaneously more accessible and more mythologically resonant than the profiles of contemporaries whose products were more digitally abstract. The Hollywood adjacency that came with Los Angeles residency and with Riley's industry connections placed Musk in a social world that was new to him in its specific texture but not in its fundamental dynamics. He had always networked with intention, had always understood that the relationships cultivated at the margins of his professional life had operational value that the relationships at its center could not supply, that the venture capitalist met at a dinner party or the senator encountered at a fundraiser could provide access or credibility or capital at moments when those resources were scarce in the ordinary channels. The Hollywood network offered a different kind of resource, cultural amplification, the ability of entertainment industry figures and their associated media infrastructure to shape public perception of ideas and individuals at a scale that the technology press alone could not achieve. Musk understood this without cynicism, or at least without exclusive cynicism. He genuinely enjoyed the company of creative people, was genuinely interested in film and storytelling, and the techniques of narrative that he encountered in the industry's practitioners, and the social world of Los Angeles offered these things alongside the more instrumental benefits of the connections it contained. The marriage to Riley moved through its first incarnation with the rhythm that characterized Musk's personal relationships under maximum professional pressure, intense and genuinely felt during the intervals when he was present, and strained by the intervals when he was not, which were long and frequent and determined by the operational demands of companies that had no stable state and no off-season. Riley later described the experience of being married to him during this period with a precision that was neither embittered nor naive. The loneliness of being in a relationship with someone whose emotional bandwidth was genuinely and not performatively consumed by things that were, on any objective scale of importance, more significant than her comfort or his. She was not a passive figure in this dynamic. She was intelligent and grounded, and possessed of her own professional identity that did not require his attention to sustain itself, and these qualities were part of what he had been drawn to. But the structural fact of the marriage remained. She was married to a man who was simultaneously trying to reach orbit and electrify the global automobile fleet, and the portions of himself that remained after those obligations were met were not always sufficient for the requirements of a sustained partnership. The first divorce, finalized in 2012, was notable for the specific quality of its aftermath, which was that it did not last. Musk and Riley reconciled and remarried in 2013, a reunion that was covered by the tabloid press with the slightly bewildered enthusiasm reserved for celebrity relationships that refuse to resolve into a stable narrative. The remarriage was not, in the accounts of people close to both of them, a sentimental impulse overriding practical judgment. It was a considered decision, made by two people who had tested the alternative of separation and found it less satisfactory than the complicated reality of the relationship itself. Riley understood him, in some fundamental way, better than most people did, understood the specific character of his attention and his absence, the way his mind worked, the shape of his ambitions and the costs they imposed on everyone in his immediate orbit, including himself. This understanding did not make the marriage easy. It made it possible for a time, in a way that nothing requiring less understanding of him could have been. The revealing quality of Musk's personal life during this period, the keyhole through which the larger character becomes legible, is perhaps most visible in a pattern that Riley identified, and that others who were close to him during these years have corroborated in various forms: his profound difficulty with solitude. For a man of such declared self-sufficiency, such operational independence, such apparent indifference to the opinions of critics and the comfort of consensus, he was constitutionally unable to be alone for extended periods. The need was not for company in the casual sense. He did not require constant social stimulation, and was capable of working in isolation for long stretches. It was for a specific kind of presence, a person who was physically in the same space and who provided, by their proximity, a kind of emotional grounding that allowed him to function at full capacity without the additional energy cost of managing the awareness of his own aloneness. He had described this need himself, in terms that combined honesty with a certain analytical detachment, as a deficiency, not a romantic preference but a structural requirement, the way some people require a specific sleeping temperature to rest properly, something about his baseline regulation that another person's presence supplied and that their absence disrupted in ways he found genuinely costly. This self-knowledge, which was real and articulately held, did not translate straightforwardly into the behaviors that would have addressed its source. Knowing that he needed sustained emotional presence and being able to provide the reciprocal investment that sustained emotional presence requires are different competencies, and the distance between them was the recurring geography of his intimate life, the genuine desire for connection, the insufficient bandwidth for its maintenance, the cycle of intensity and absence that left the people who loved him caring for him and depleted by him in roughly equal measure. The broader celebrity that accumulated around Musk during the Riley years was not something he sought in the manner of a person who had identified fame as a goal. It was a byproduct of the work, amplified by a media environment that was developing new tools for the production and distribution of personality-driven narrative, and that found in him a subject of unusual richness. The South African immigrant who had arrived in North America with almost nothing and had built rockets and electric cars by the force of will and the application of first principles thinking to problems that everyone else had decided were solved. The narrative had the structure of the great American stories. The immigrant made good arc that the culture processed with the reliable appetite of a mythology that had been refreshing itself since the country's founding. That Musk was not American by birth made the story more rather than less compelling, a validation of the premise rather than a complication of it. Iron Man was a specific and consequential node in this process of cultural mythologization. Jon Favreau, directing the 2008 film, had consulted Musk during production and had incorporated elements of his persona and his aesthetic into the character of Tony Stark, the genius industrialist with a flair for the dramatic and a conviction that technology, properly applied, could solve problems that politics could not. Robert Downey Jr. had visited SpaceX for research. The resulting character bore enough resemblance to the public version of Musk that the association became self-reinforcing, each reference amplifying the other, until it was genuinely difficult to say which way the influence ran. Whether Stark had borrowed from Musk, or whether Musk had, in his public presentations and his product launches and his chosen aesthetic of the billionaire engineer hero, begun to perform a version of himself that the Iron Man films had helped to define. The ambiguity was not uncomfortable for him. He appeared in Iron Man 2 in a brief cameo, the real person occupying the fictional universe that had been partly built around his image, completing a loop whose circularity he appeared to find amusing. The second marriage to Riley ended with a second divorce, finalized in 2016 with a finality that was more settled than the first. By then, Musk's public profile had reached a scale that the first divorce had not anticipated. The Tesla stock performance, the SpaceX Falcon 9 achievements, the Gigafactory, the public debates about AI safety. The accumulated weight of a decade of extraordinary and documented achievement had transformed him from a notable technology figure into something closer to a global icon. A person whose private life was now of interest to audiences who could not have named the CEO of any other automotive or aerospace company. Riley departed this larger stage with the same composure she had brought to its earlier, smaller version. And the accounts she offered of the relationship's end were marked by the quality that had characterized her throughout. Clear-eyed about what had happened, generous about the person it had happened with, and honest about the cost that proximity to a force of that magnitude exacts from the people who choose to stand near it. What Musk was moving toward in his personal life as 2016 closed around him, the relationships that would form and break and form again in the years that followed, the children who would arrive with the frequency and the complexity that reflected both his need for connection and his difficulty with its ordinary requirements, remained, like so much else in his life during this period, in a state of declared intention that had not yet fully encountered the reality it was moving toward, the next chapter of his intimate history, assembling itself in the wings of a stage already crowded with rockets and factories and AI laboratories, and the gathering storm of a production ramp that would test everything he had built, and everyone who had helped him build it in ways that no personal life, however carefully constructed, could insulate him from or prepare him for.